Lisa. Our train is almost here. Right on time. And to be honest with you, I am very happy that you came up with this idea. A sudden and spontaneous train ride. No luggage or baggages. Just you and me and our destination. And we will take care of the rest when we get there.
Isn't this awesome? I'm so glad that you agreed to do this with me. We are going to have such a great time together.
And it is a very long trip. Therefore, I will have more than ample time to give you a full-length and uninterrupted account of several chapters of Soblar.
I know. This was the plan. This way I get to kidnap you.
I am a willing victim. Oh, I think the train is coming.
Okay, Azoria. I am ready if you are.
Very well, Lisa. I am ready.
But before you start, get into character first.
You got it. I will. Here we go. Greetings. I am Azoria, your narrator. And today we will continue exploring the exciting stories within the Book of Soblar. Concealed Revelations Volume 1. In the last episode we reached the cryptic conclusion of Chapter 1. Uninformed Casualties. The last chapter brought all of us into the beginning of the trail followed by Clarence Douglas. One, which will lead him to an impending doom. What is the real urgency for Vaughn and Burton to find out how he survived the destruction of the town? It also left us wondering, what was the strange homeless man up to? How was it that Ramon could not remember what transpired between them? What was the source of little Laura's nightmares? And what did the lady inside the doctor's office may have known about little Laura that we are not yet aware of? Or is this the moment when Clarence and Helena begin their futile romance? It will all be explained in due time, as we continue our journey into the world of Soblar. Concealed Revelations Volume 1. And now, this is Chapter 2, Ephemeral Legacy. Let us begin. Susan accelerated her steps towards the bus stop, which was still under renovation after a lengthy takeover and remodeling project conducted by the newly appointed local government. But for the time being, there were no new buses stopping there. Most of the bus stops were still being attended by private companies, which had control over the transportation businesses in several cities and towns throughout the country. These small companies knew their time was almost up, due to the new regulations ready to be implemented any day now by the recently elected president, thus prompting them to operate their vehicles, mostly mid-sized minivans, not really intended for transportation of large groups, to more than their full capacity, and without much regard for the safety of their passengers. All in order to maximize their profits and make as much money as they could in the little time they had left to operate their business. Susan caught a glimpse of one of the minivans about to leave from the bus stop. It was completely overcrowded. She looked at her children knowing that it would be nearly impossible for them to have a safe journey back home in such conditions. She looked towards the street, becoming aware that another one had just departed and passed right by her and her children. Going at full speed, Susan grabbed their hands and asked them to walk a little faster. They needed to make it to the stop before the next minivan arrived, which based on the schedule she had calculated, it would be approaching from 3 blocks away. As Susan and the children got to the stop, there were already another large group of people waiting for the next van to arrive. "Mom," Laura whispered nervously, as she pulled down her mother's hand. Susan glanced over at David, with worry, and then she looked at Laura, before picking her up in her arms. The van got to the stop very abruptly. The crowd of people did not wait for it to make a full stop, or for the other passengers to finish exiting, when they began to jump on board from every direction and through any opening. 2 men assisted the driver, and they were in charge of collecting the fares from each of the passengers. There were momentary commotions and even some punches thrown, Susan hesitated to even attempt to get to the side door of the van when she saw how one young teenager was pushed so hard that he fell to the ground head first. One customer paid his fare to one of the men in charge of collecting, and he quickly got himself on top of the van, where he secured himself by holding onto the roof rack, where the cargo normally is loaded. Susan looked over at David and at Laura, who she was still carrying in her arms and was already asleep. She hesitated, but attempted to take a few steps forward. She tried to get to the side of the passenger front door of the van, but was pushed back by the moving crowd, everyone trying to strong-arm themselves into the vehicle. She was about to fall backwards, with Laura slipping away from her arms, but Clarence happened to be walking right behind her and was able to catch her in the nick of time. Susan stared in shock as Clarence held onto her back and arms to make sure she was balanced. "Estás bien? Are you okay?" Clarence asked Susan, speaking in Spanish to her, as best as he could. Helena remained nearby. She was standing next to David, patting his head reassuringly, making sure he was also okay. Helena noticed the mother and son looked exactly alike. Dark brown hair, tan skin, the same full lips and small eyes, while the daughter, with her black silky hair, big round eyes and round cheeks and pale skin, who looked nothing like her mother, must take after her father. "What's your name, little boy?" Helena asked him, smiling. "You look so handsome in your overalls. And your shirt suits you so well too." She did her best to be friendly, but David looked down nervously and did not reply. "Sí. Ay Dios mío. Gracias," Susan said to Clarence. "Yes. Oh my God. Thank you. If not for you, I would have fallen for sure. And my daughter. She could have been hurt badly. Thank you so much, sir." At that moment, Laura opened her eyes and saw that Clarence was still holding her and her mother. Clarence looked at Laura, and suddenly, a very strange sensation took over him. It was something which went far into a deep part of his being. "Hola, ¿cómo te sientes? Hi, are you okay there?" Clarence asked Laura, but her eyes were heavy, and she closed them again as she replied to him. "Sí. Gracias," Laura whispered. "She is really tired," Susan said. "She hasn't slept the past 4 nights." Clarence asked her if she and the children needed help getting somewhere, but Susan told him that the only way of getting home was getting in one of the vans. "Now we'll have to wait for another one to arrive," Susan said, without much hope. "This one was a lost cause. Look at it," she added. "A total mess." She then took hold of David's hand. Helena held on Clarence's hand tightly, pulling him to walk with her. Clarence waved goodbye to Susan and the children, and slowly walked away from them. But he could not help looking back at Laura. He had a strange feeling about her and her family. "Are you okay?" Helena asked him. He nodded yes to her, but took one last look back at Laura before turning the corner of the street with Helena. Clarence and Helena then walked 3 more blocks to the special place she said she had decided to bring him. "And we are finally here, Clarence," Helena said, pulling Clarence to walk faster. She told him she did not know anyone that would want to go there with her. It was a tea house that opened not too long ago by a woman from Calcutta, India, who had recently moved to the country with her husband. "I have never told this to anyone." Helena decided to share something personal with Clarence. "Clarence, I am addicted to tea, thanks to my mother and my aunt. They used to drink tea whenever they ran out of coffee. I used to go behind their backs and drink the leftover from the pot with a little bit of sugar, and ever since then, I have always loved drinking tea, if I can, at least once every day." Clarence and Helena both left together as Helena finished telling him the story from her early childhood. They stared at each other. "Clarence, this has been a beautiful day," Helena said as she played with her hair, curling it between her fingertips. Clarence nodded, agreeing with her. He did not say much after, but she noticed he could not take his eyes away from her. He knew in his mind that he may have never been so interested in anyone his entire life. Then, after enjoying a cup of yerba mate tea, the tea was recommended to Clarence by the store owner herself. He and Helena engaged in a much deeper conversation. They spoke about everything, almost without feeling any inhibition. They told each other different aspects about their lives. Or so Clarence made Helena believe. For Clarence, it was an incredible experience, and what he thought would be the beginning of a very special chapter in his life. Meanwhile, a few corners away from there, another one of the minivans had arrived to the stop. "Mom," David said, pulling on the side of his mother's green dress. "I don't want to get to the house when it's dark again. It's too scary. Can we go somewhere else that is not the house? Please." David was completely right in not wanting to get back home at night. Indeed, it was getting late, and Susan did not want to entertain the thought of arriving to her very dangerous neighborhood with the daylight already spent. She exhaled deeply and looked down to the ground before preparing herself for what was next. At that moment, during the struggle to get into the second-to-last van leaving that part of town, one of the men collecting the fares began shouting out loud, "There is no more room left. We are ready to leave." When David heard the announcement, he began to cry, and telling his mother that he wanted to get home already. Susan attempted to take another step towards the van, but the previous announcement caused even more commotion amongst those who were still not able to board the vehicle. Things got even crazier. People wanted to get on board no matter how or where in the van they ended up traveling. The van was already filled to capacity. The driver was writing down the fares collected on this trip onto a notebook, when something distracted him momentarily. He put his notebook down and the reflection of someone passing right by his window got his attention. He looked out through the rearview mirror, thinking he may have seen a little boy, barefoot and wearing shorts and a gray t-shirt, walking away from him. But when he brought his head out of the window to take a good look outside, there was no one like that on his side of the van. "Cameron." "Shrimp," the driver barked, calling out to one of the fare collectors to get over to his window. Cameron was a very skinny individual with an aggressive attitude and a scary face. He was the second in command when it came to the route. He got near the driver's door. The driver whispered something to his ear. Cameron asked him if he was sure about what he had just told him. The driver nodded his head positively, without looking or saying anything else to him. At that moment, the other collector began pushing back the rest of the people who wanted to get inside the van. Some of them attempted to bargain with him, offering a few extra pesos in the way of bribe. But as they saw Cameron approaching, they all quickly backed away from the person and from the vehicle. "You there!" Cameron shouted, pointing to Susan with his index finger. Susan turned her head to see if there was someone behind her. She thought that the fare collector could not possibly be talking to her. A man behind her was quick to walk towards Cameron, thinking it was him who was being called. But Cameron quickly shook his head. "No, no too, gordito. No, not you, chubby guy." Cameron then walked near Susan and pulled her away by the hand. She and her children were out of the crowd in an instant. Then, after shuffling some of the passengers already inside the van to open a very narrow gap, he was able to push Susan and her children into a small space, which the driver usually kept for allowing distance between him and the rest of the passengers. Laura sat on Susan's lap as David squeezed in close to his mother. "Thank you so much," Susan said to the driver. She was so relieved that she could barely contain how happy she was. She could not believe how lucky she and the children had been. She adjusted Laura's blue cotton dress so she could sit more comfortably and also to cover her knees. David placed the bag with their belongings on the floor by his feet while he held on to his mother's arm.
What is she thanking me for?"
The driver looked at Susan with a puzzled look on his face, but then ignored her as he began to drive away from the bus stop. As the minivan pulled away from the curb, a passenger gripping onto the side ladder and the cargo basket on top of the van dropped to the floor on his back. The fare collectors, as well as a few passengers, saw when it happened, immediately disregarding it while looking the other way. The guy stood right back up and ran after the van until he was able to catch up to it, to climb on top of the rear bumper, while holding on to the edges of the rear window. The man already on top of the van grabbed hold of his hand and helped him from falling backward again. Cameron noticed what the other man had done. but ignored the situation when the other collector signaled to him that his fare had already been collected earlier. The trip was very uncomfortable for Susan and the children. The curvy and bumpy road didn't help the situation for anyone inside the vehicle. Several other people almost fell out from it. Yet again. But Susan, holding both of her children very tight, was just relieved that she was able to make it inside, and where it was safe. Almost an hour later, it was already dark, and there was a power outage when the minivan had finally arrived to Susan's stop. Upon arriving there, Roland was the first one to jump off the side of the red passenger door, where he had been hanging from throughout the entire trip. He looked everywhere, and was quick to get a small knife out from the side of his high-top sneakers. He stood nervously on guard, while allowing the departing passengers to get off the van. He looked around in every direction to see if anyone suspicious attempted to approach him. The other fare collector, or the driver. The other fare collector did the same as well, also holding his own knife. After allowing a few other passengers off, Susan and the children stepped out of the van as well. Even though it was already dark and David did not want to be outside for much longer, he found the need to beg his mother to get him his favorite candy before they went to their house. Susan was about to say no to him, but Laura asked her for a cupcake. She had not eaten much during the day, and Susan decided to venture towards the nearest grocery store, which she knew would be closing very soon. She took a second look at the direction to her house and she noticed that the road ahead was already getting darker. "Okay, let's go and get you guys the snacks," she said to the kids. "Hey, caballero," Susan called out, getting the attention of the man inside the very well-gated grocery store. "Please, can you attend me?" Susan asked hurriedly. The man looked at Susan and then looked around in a very rushed manner, deciding to attend her, only after seeing the children with her. "Okay, quickly. What do you want?" "Just one of those chocolate candies, a guava cupcake, medium-sized milk, bread, half a dozen eggs and 2 pounds of chicken," Susan said to the store attendant. And in no time she got what she needed and began making her way to her house. David took a moment to look around as Laura held hands with him and Susan, remaining in between them. It was very dark and there was no electricity throughout the neighborhood since early in the afternoon. The people walking about in the streets seemed like shadows swerving from side to side. David was very afraid of the dark, and even more afraid of what took place in their neighborhood at night. "Mom," David mumbled. He tried to get closer to his mother, but he knew he had to hold his little sister's hand instead and be brave for her. "It's okay, David, let's just walk as fast as we can, and let's stay very close together, and we will make it to the house very fast." Susan tried to reassure the children, as they all walked very close to the edge of the street, where they passed several parked vehicles, which looked like they've seen much better days, perhaps 20 years earlier. "But it's dark," David replied. "Mommy." Laura then spoke. Her voice was trembling. "Why don't you close your eyes as you walk, my dear?" Susan said to her. "Your brave big brother and I are holding your hands. We are both by your sides, so nothing can happen to you. Does that sound okay?" Laura agreed to do as her mother told her. She closed her eyes and allowed David and Susan to guide the way for her. They were now about to pass a corner where they heard the voices of a small group of shadowy and dangerous individuals. They were talking in hushed tones, which made the children scare. The individuals became quiet and looked up at the family walking in their direction. Susan deviated from walking by that corner and went across the street to avoid them. This was just as a car with only one headlight passed by them. They got scared again. The car passed by a little too closely, and it was then followed by a line of motorcycles driving too fast. Another motorcycle driving even faster, with the driver screaming at the pedestrians in his way. After making it to the other side of the street, David looked back at the strangers and saw them walking away from where they were standing. He saw them disappearing into the shadows as Susan accelerated her steps. "I'm scared." David's teeth chattered as he spoke. He knew he had to be brave, but he felt like crying. "We are almost there," Susan told David. "Just hold on. When we get home, you can have that yummy chocolate. And Laura, you can have your cupcake. Doesn't that sound great?" Susan tried to do her best to quiet the children's fears. David kept looking back and seeing shadows moving all around as if they were following them. He could hear in his mother's voice, no matter what she was saying, that she too was afraid. His skin was covered in goosebumps. He was beginning to feel cold again, the same sensation that he was used to feeling when he was afraid, inside his own house. As he looked behind and ahead, everything was becoming darker and darker each step they took. The number of pedestrians became less and less, until they were almost left alone in the streets. Susan continued walking and asking the kids to keep up with her. She also wanted to make it to the house as soon as possible, but her steps were slow. She wished she did not have to buy so many groceries, so that she would have been able to carry Laura in her arms and walk a little faster. David looked back again and saw what appeared to be 3 people walking not too far behind them. They seemed to have been slipping back and forth between the abandoned parked vehicles scattered throughout the street, where more and more, most of the properties in that particular area of town were all boarded up, and the ones that were not were already abandoned by their former owners. All of a sudden, David felt a very strange sensation. He looked at Susan, but she was too focused in trying to get him and Laura home safe. He then looked over to the window of a house to the right side of the street. He saw someone extinguishing a candlestick, which had been by the edge of the window. David could almost see the person watching them from within the dark place. He did not know what to do. Everything was scaring him, and the sensation he was feeling was beginning to overwhelm him. He again looked at Susan and attempted to say something to her, but yet again decided not to. He looked down to the ground and also at his right hand as he continued walking and nervously looking all around. But this time, something else was happening. Susan and maybe even Laura did not notice it, but David did. He noticed it and felt it as well. He and Laura, they were effortlessly keeping up with Susan. It was almost as if someone was pushing them from behind, helping them walk faster. Feeling the easiness of the way in which David was now walking, Susan took a peek at him while holding Laura's hand, and, without slowing her own steps, now only a block away from the house, David was feeling more relaxed. But for some reason, he still kept looking over at his right hand from time to time. He did so in an inconspicuous manner. "Mommy," Laura whispered, while her eyes kept slightly opening and closing, as they were already turning onto the narrow street where their house was located. "Yes, dear?" Susan replied. "Who is that?" Laura asked, pointing to David with her face. Susan looked at David and looked around as she walked faster, seeing her house was only steps away. "Who, baby?" Susan asked Laura. "What are you talking about?" She added, "Who is that, Mommy?" Laura again asked, "Baby, who?" Susan let go of Laura's hand so that she could get her keys out from her purse. Before getting close to the door, "David, hold on to your sister, please." Susan asked David to hold onto Laura's hand tightly. As they walked towards the door, Susan looked around one more time. She did not see anyone, but heard murmuring nearby. She could only see the silhouettes of a few of her neighbors, walking around with their flashlights or candles in hand. They were also attempting to get inside their properties as fast as they could. With the keys out of her purse, Susan quickly opened one of the 3 locks of the fence protecting the front door of their modest small house. Laura rubbed her eyes with her right hand and attempted to make out something she believed she saw behind David. She did her best to make out what it was, but it was too dark, and she was too tired to see with clarity. She then turned to look at her mother, before turning to look behind David one more time. David kept looking at his right hand. He shook it from side to side, but he was not able to snap out of the very strange sensation that someone was holding it. He looked at Laura, but decided not to say anything to her. He then looked back at the street. He saw someone walking towards them from a half-block's distance. The person was walking very slowly and appeared to be walking while keeping a hand against the newly erected tall wall of one of the abandoned properties, which had been purposely isolated, for some reason, from the rest of the houses around it. David stared at the person approaching their direction. "Let's go in," Susan said. They rushed inside the house, and Susan locked all the locks of her front door in a flash. The person David had seen walking towards them, near the wall. It was a homeless woman, with long hair, a cigarette in her mouth, and wearing what may have been a long dress. She squatted down, touching the ground, to see what she could find around the street floor. Inside Susan's house, it was pitch black, and she and the children were unable to see anything. But it didn't matter to them, since they were inside and felt safe. David, get the candles, Susan said while she reached for a box of matches inside the drawer of a cabinet in the kitchen, which was part of the living room. Found it, David said, handing over the box of candles to Susan. She then struck a match and reached for one of the candles. She noticed there were only 2 of them left inside the box David had handed to her. One of the 2 had been halfway melted from the last power outage. Then, someone began banging on her door hard. Susan looked up, startled. Laura hugged her brother tightly. David led Laura to hide with him under the table. Susan had dropped the match and the candle on the floor, but quickly bent down to find them. She couldn't see anything in front or behind her. Oh God, she thought, as her heart pounded in fear. David and Laura were crawling towards where Susan was. "It's okay, darlings. It's going to be fine," Susan told the children as she moved around the floor searching for them. Just outside the door, someone was yelling out and calling out someone's name. They continued banging against the door and the front windows, making it sound as though they would break them at any moment. "Come here," Susan whispered to David, who was not yet near her. She searched the floor and finally found the matches. She lit one of them, and David could now see her frightened face. Susan looked at Laura, who was next to her, and the little girl was quiet and stood completely still next to the table. Her eyes were wide open. She was petrified, but her eyes gave the notion that she was also very aware of what was happening. Susan asked her to come over with her, under the table, but Laura stayed still, just staring ahead, into the darkness, near the front door. For a moment, Susan looked at Laura, trying to figure out what was going through her mind. She then crawled over to her and held her close, while holding David's hand. Only when she had both children under her embrace, she was able to exhale. Then after, they all hunkered down under the table, where they remained quietly. Outside, the noise and the banging sounds had finally ceased. But by that time, Susan and the children had fallen asleep under the table. They were exhausted. When Susan opened her eyes, she realized her children were sound asleep. She embraced them tightly and remained right where she was, deciding to stay there throughout the rest of the night. But as she slowly closed her eyes again, Susan failed to notice something very strange. The fading glow emanating from the back of Laura's head, and a shadow vanishing away from the table. At the same time, outside of the city of Vancouver, Canada, there was chaos. Fire and explosions being heard. A badly injured man, bleeding from the head and the face, desperately attempted to crawl away from someone. Although he was not able to, he continued trying to turn his face to look back at whoever was coming after him. Only steps away from that man, the remain of dozens of other men rested all over the debris and ruins of a nearly destroyed warehouse. The tip of a sword slowly scratched a line in the floor, a line which led to one of the man's leg. "No, no, no." The man crawling on the floor cried out. Just before, the sword was brutally nailed into his back. He gasped for air as he took his last breath, while his killer cleaned the blood off the sword against his own forearm. He was a ninja, dressed completely in black. His headgear, gloves, boots, and garments, with only his merciless eyes being visible under his disguise. He lifted his sword, nearing his face, where he keens his eyes on the cloth hanging from its handle. It was a long red fabric, with the images of several birds embroidered throughout. 5 others, dressed like him, jumped out from nowhere and dropped next to him. Then, the sounds of a door being knocked down caused them to turn and look. "Master." The killer sheathed his sword, while bowing deeply in reverence, as the others around him had done. Slow steps were heard, approaching the ninjas. They kneeled, touching their foreheads to the floor. The steps had come to a stop, near the head of the killer.
Joby. Tom and Sela. Ma.
Joby. Have they been disposed of? A deep-sounding voice addressed the killer, speaking in Chinese. Shide. Shu rentai mendo. Sela. Yes, master. They are all dead. Joby replied, while keeping his eyes to the floor. Tremble shi. Zhao. Yiga. Tremble. He was the last one to die. Joby added.
Hen. How? Very well, Joby. You will all be rewarded. Now go. Heal your wounds. I will be calling upon you all soon.
After Joby heard his master's final command, there was a brief moment of silence, before the slow steps were heard getting farther away from his head, and the others, paying their reverence. Joby calmly lifted his face. He now became aware that he was no longer in the presence of his master. He and the others slowly got on their feet, and looked at each other, nodding their heads with affirmation to one another. Joby looked up towards the ceiling, and then only the remains of the dozens of dead bodies and the flames engulfing the warehouse was what was left behind, parallel to a trail of destruction and chaos. And this will be the conclusion of episode 3. Join me next time for episode 4 and the exciting conclusion of chapter 2, Ephemeral Legacy. Cheers. I will see you all on the next episode.